Good day, everyone. Today, I will be reporting the dynamic semantics in the representation of discourse. Theoretical background. In the type of predicate logic notation introduced for semantic analysis in Chapter 1, pronoun resolution can be handled through the use of the same variable for both a pronoun and its antecedent. So in 357a, a man arrived and he sat down, while in B, the inverted E and X means that there exists M and X is that it means such that it is a man, while the A and X is and it arrived, and the S and X means that and it sat down. So the referent of the pronoun is indicated by the use of the same variable X for he as for a man. So this is much the way pronoun resolution within a sentence is handled in syntax, where identical subscripts are used to indicate coreference, even within a single sentence. However, coreference isn't always entirely straightforward. So for 358, now Brer Fox always kept one eye on Brer Rabbit, and when he saw Brer Rabbit slipping off, Brer Fox crept after him. He knew Brer Rabbit must be up to something or other, and he thought he would watch him to see what he did. So within the second sentence of this example, we see four instances of he and one instance of him. Of these five pronouns, three have Brer Fox as the referent, and two have Brer Rabbit as the referent. So most relevantly, the last three instances appear after these two characters have already been evoked within the same sentence. Hence, both are salient, yet native speakers have absolutely no trouble distinguishing which pronoun takes which character as its referent. The primary issues motivating dynamic semantics had to do with cases that couldn't be represented satisfactorily or in some cases couldn't be represented at all. Within the existing semantic notation, consider the 359. So in 359, Patty bought a donut. She ate it. So this is an exceedingly simple discourse, and yet it is one that our current machinery is unable to deal with. Consider how one might represent 359. In 360a, it means that it says that there exists some entity X which is a donut and which Patty both. But in 360b, we encounter a problem. So we've got Patty and we've got the fact that she ate X, but there's no indication of what X is. So certainly, there's nothing to indicate that it's the same entity as the first sentence, because each sentence has a distinct representation. There is no way for the quantifier that binds the variable in the first sentence to also bind the variable in the second sentence. And a variable that's not bound by a quantifier has no interpretation. So in 361, this represents the sentence Patty did not eat anything. So there exists no X such that Patty ate it. So without a quantifier, there is no indication of X existence or lack thereof. Hence, 360b cannot be interpreted as Patty ate and ate something. So you might wonder why we don't simply string together the two sentences as a conjunction. So as a translation of 362, so there exists an X such that it's a donut and Patty bought it and Patty ate it. So although some proposals have suggested allowing the scope of the existential to scoop over the subsequent discourse across sentence boundaries, such an approach could not extend to the universal operator, for which there is evidence that binding of variables really does end at a sentence boundary. So in 363a, every girl bought a donut. But in 363b, uh, she isn't bound by every because there's a sentence boundary, and binding doesn't hold across sentence boundaries, whereas every girl said she was hungry would be fine, since she would be bounded by every. So 363 doesn't mean that for every girl picked out in the first sentence, that same girl is said in the second sentence to have both a donut. In fact, without some other available referent for she, the discourse is infelicious. So the difficulty doesn't stop there. However, even within a single sentence, there are cases in which representing pronominal reference becomes an interactable problem. So let us consider 364. So if Patty owns a donut, she eats it. So the question here is how to capture the meaning of it in the second clause. This is a case of what has come to be known as donkey anaphora, so called because the first cases discussed in the literature involve farmers beating donkeys. So a first attempt at representing how we interpret this sentence might be in 365. So we might think this reads as if there exists some entity such that it's a donut and Patty owns it, then Patty eats it. But that's not quite right. The problem is that the final X is not bound by the existential quantifier. So the pair of parentheses that open immediately after the quantification there exists close immediately before the arrow and leave out the part that follows the arrow. So 365 really reads if there exists some entity such that it's a donut and Patty owns it, then Patty eats it. X. So where the last clause is once again an open proposition with X unspecified. So in 366, so now the parentheses that began immediately after the quantification don't close until the end. So therefore, we've got the final mention of the donut tidily inside the scope of existential where we want it. But now, we've got a new problem. This doesn't seem to mean what we want it to mean. So the formula in 366 instead reads, there exists an entity such that if it is a donut and Patty owns it, she eats it. This doesn't seem to be what 364 means at all. So in 367 reads as for all x, if x is a donut and Patty owns it, she eats it. Or everything which is a donut and which Patty owns, Patty eats. So this seems to get the truth conditions. So this seems to get the truth conditions right. Although one might counter that if Patty owns a dozen donuts, so 364 does not seem to require that she eats all of them, whereas 367 does. So certainly the emphasis seems misplaced, as 367 seems to be about donuts, whereas 364 is about Patty, though of course that's a matter of pragmatics, not semantics. So static versus dynamic approaches to meaning. The predicate logic notational system sketched in Chapter 1 is a static system. In a sense, it represents the meaning of one individual sentence. However, we also talked in the chapter about possible words and discourse models where a discourse model maps onto a set of possible words in which the propositions represented by the model are true. Recall the example used in the discussion in example 10, here as 368. So in 368, a slave named Androcles once escaped from his master and fled to the forest. As he was wandering about there, he came upon a lion lying down, meaning and groaning. So here, the first sentence introduces three entities, the slave, the master, and the forest, into the discourse model and attributes various properties to them, being named Androcles, having escaped, having been escaped from, and so on. So this is straightforward, though a bit tedious to represent in our predicate logic motion. So this is the translation for 369. Here, S is for slave, A is for Androcles, M is for master of, F is for forest, E for escape from, and L to fled to. Thus, the whole string means essentially that there exist three entities that the first is a slave and is named Androcles, and the second is his master, and the third is the forest, and the first escaped from the second and fled to the third. So as we've seen, however, a static model of semantic representation leaves us stumped once we arrive at the second sentence. So there is no way to represent the fact that the referent of he is the same as the referent of a slave in the first sentence. What is needed is a system that retains the discourse, model, information, discourse reference, their properties, actions, and so on from the first sentence and serially updates it with information from each subsequent sentence. Such a system is called a dynamic system, since the model is dynamically updated as the discourse progresses. A number of semantic theories of this type have been proposed, all of which fall within the field of dynamic semantics. So it should be clear, however, that so-called dynamic semantics here is encroaching on the traditional territory of pragmatics. We're talking about an ongoing representation of the discourse model known as the discourse record, which is inherently dynamic and continually updated as the discourse progresses, with a new discourse referent being and new properties and so on being attributed to both old and new discourse referents in the discourse record. So dynamic systems typically do away with the existential and universal quantifiers as a way of binding discourse reference. So once a discourse referent has been introduced, it's not doomed to have its status lapse at the end of the sentence. As with our former semantic notation, dynamic systems take various approaches to the problem of anaphora, but a major concern of all such systems is the problem of pronoun resolution across sentences, in the related problem of donkey anaphora. So Haim 1983, 1983b, and 1988, for example, has proposed a system of file change semantics in which each discourse referent is represented as a mental file card with properties added to the file card as the discourse progresses. Under this system, the first sentence of 368 would add three file cards to the model, one with the properties Androcles slave, one with the property master of Androcles, and one with the property forest. Discourse representation theory. So discourse representation theory is a theory of the interlocutor's ongoing discourse record, which is represented by the discourse representation structure, DRS. So the DRS will change with each utterance. Each DRS serves as the context against which the subsequent sentence is interpreted, and on which the subsequent DRS is built. So each DRS is represented as a box containing a set of discourse, referents, and a set of conditions that might prove to be either true or false. In 370, a slave named Androcles once escaped. We might represent this as shown in the DRS in 371. So in 371 is the variable x, slave and variable x, Androcles the x, and escape x. So here, the top line provides the universe of discourse, the set of referent presents in the discourse. So in this rather impoverished little discourse, there is only one known entity, represented here by the variable x. So there are three conditions that apply to this entity, represented by the propositions in the box. So the entity is a slave. His name Antrocles, and he only escaped. We'll ignore the complexities of tense here. So the actual first sentence given in 368 is of course a bit more complicated. So in 372, a slave named Androcles once escaped from his master and fled to the forest. So this DRS retains all of the information from the previous DRS, but adds to two referents. So the first, the referent of he is represented by U, since we've run out of end of the alphabet letters and equated with X. So this is how DRT indicates the co-reference of a slave in the first sentence and he in the second. It wouldn't do to simply continue to use S for the second sentence, since it would eliminate the crucial detail that the pronoun doesn't in fact have to be coreferential with a slave evoked in the first sentence, one could imagine the following discourse. So 376, a slave named Androcles once escaped from his master and fled to the forest. As he was prowling that same area of the forest, a lion heard Androcles crashing through the underbrush. So here, he in the second sentence takes the lion as its referent, despite the fact that the discourse up to the point of its utterance is identical to that in 374. So in short, coreference, as we've observed before, is something that must be established contextually and hence must be explicitly noted in the DRS rather than taken as a given. So we do, however, need a way of capturing the boundedness of discourse entities. So the limits that we were captured in our old system by means of quantifier scope. So as illustrated above in 363, not every attempt at pronominal reference across a sentence boundary is successful. So in 377, the A, every girl bought a donut, and B, every girl was hungry. She bought a donut. So this is where the borders of the box come in. In DRT, there are rules that determine when referents and conditions are added to an existing box and when a new box is created. So, and there are also rules that determine when the information in a given box is accessible to the information in another one. For example, when a variable in one box can take its referent from an entity introduced in another box. So to see how DRT handles 377, consider first the DRs for 377A. So just as we would use a conditional in our old notation for such a sentence, we use a conditional here. The difference is that here the conditional itself becomes a condition within the DRS. So in this case, in fact, it's the only condition within the larger DRS. Uh, this would be easier if the word condition weren't being used in two rather different ways at the same time. So the truth conditions for this DRS are as we would expect. It is true of a situation if it's the case that if an entity is a girl, there is another entity such that it is a donut and she bought it. So as with previous instances of every n, so the first sentence here is treated as a conditional. So if X is a girl, then X was hungry. The next sentence is outside the conditional. So its contents are represented within the larger DRS, which introduces two new referents, one for she and one for a donut, much as we did for he and a lion in 375. So the difference is that in 375, there is a previous entity within the DRS available for co-reference with he, and so the two are readily equated. So the scope of DRT and the domain of pragmatics. So the most obvious advantage of DRT is that it can represent running discourse by providing a means of tracking reference from one sentence to another within the discourse. As with most schemes of semantic representation, it of course works best with very simple discourses. The complexity of the average discourse would result in a prohibitively complex DRS in very short order. So, however, this doesn't mean the DRS wouldn't be an accurate representation of the discourse in the potentially even an accurate representation of how we interpret the discourse, which, recall, is a slightly different thing. What looks typographically daunting might be quite plausible computationally or which may or may not be the same thing psychologically. So another, perhaps less obvious advantage of DRT is that it provides not only a formal notation for representing sentences, something that other systems of formal semantics also supply, but that it replaces certain options for representation with rules for the use of those options. So thus the representations lost some of their ad hoc flavor, which is a good thing. Recall that one major aspect of the donkey sentence problem was the fact that indefiniteness were sometimes introduced by means of an existential quantifier and sometimes by means of a universal quantifier, as illustrated in 378 to 388. So the notations in 387b and 388b seem to be represent the respective sentences well enough, although as noted above the representation in 388b seems to be more about the donut than about patty, which might cause us some discomfort. So the real problem is that in 387, the indefinite adonat is represented by means of an existential, while in 388, it's it represented by the means of a universal. So as a way of representing the sentences in question, this seems fine, but as a way of representing the way we speakers actually understand sentences in questions, it's inadequate. So DRT gets us around this problem of circularity, whereas predicate logic gives us a way of representing meaning. So DRT replaces certain options for representing meaning with rules for those representations. So instead of a cafeteria, we're given a recipe instead of choosing from among an array of options depending on what we want the result to look like. We're given the rules that tells us how to get from an initial state, linguistic expressions, to an end state, meanings. So this is what a hearer does in interpreting language. After all, they are given linguistic expressions as input and have to get from there to the meanings using a set of rules, their linguistic competence. So DRT enforces a rule to the effect that every time a conditional is used, a hypothetical situation represented by a subordinate DRS is constructed. So the hearer, upon encountering the linguistic from outside of the hypothetical. So in this way, the semantic representation is no longer developed in ad hoc way, driven by the interpretations we've already implicitly assigned the sentences, but is instead developed in a rule-governed way. There may be some conditions that don't change at all between the two DRS because they're not addressed in the sentence being added. So their truth or falsity is irrelevant to the meaning of the current sentence because they don't change between the two DRS. Thus, consider the following discourse. So in 389, Patty bought a donut. It was chocolate. So this two-sentence discourse can be represented by the sequence of DRS shown in 390 to 391. So the first sentence, Patty bought a donut, is represented by the DR as in 390. So the entire discourse in 389 is represented by the DRS in 391. So the meaning of the second sentence is, it was chocolate. Is the difference between these two DRS. So the first DRS maps onto a context that is include patty, a donut, and an event of her buying the donut. So the second DRS maps onto a slightly different set of contexts, with the only change being that the donut, importantly the same donut referred to in the first sentence as indicated by in 391 was chocolate. So that then is the meaning of the second sentence that the donut referred to in the first sentence was chocolate. So in short, DRT appears to give the right result and has the advantage that the meaning given for the second sentence is able to access the referent of it, a crucial element of the meaning of the sentence. So as for 392, so now Brer Fox always kept one eye on Brer Rabbit, and when he saw Brer Rabbit slipping off, Brer Fox crept after him. He knew Brer Rabbit must be up to something or other, and he thought he would watch him to see what he did. So as noted above, the second sentence of the discourse contains four instances of the pronoun he and one instance of its accusative direct object variant him. So as noted above, the second sentence of the discourse contains four instances of the pronoun he and one instance of its accusative direct object variant him. So the obvious question is how the reader knows in each of these cases whether the referent of the pronoun is Brer Fox or Brer Rabbit. So in a discourse such as that in 389, resolving pronoun it is trivially straightforward. There are only two potential referents to the discourse, patty and donut, and patty can be referred to it. So the donut is the only available referent for it, and the DRS in 391 reflects this with. So in 392,